Hi again. This is a just a finishing up of the recording. I didn't have a whole lot on 12D, and I just loaded it. So I just want to continue this. Uh, 'Cause before I started 13, I'd forgotten that I hadn't quite entirely finished this particular, and it really summarizes a little bit of from that last presentation. Sensory pathways from different kinds of receptors everywhere. They will spread, and again, they will. The first nerve will either go into the spinal cord and switch, and you'll see some illustrations, or go up to the medulla and switch, and with what's called a second order neuron. By definition, these are interneurons, which we have more of than anything else, connectors. And the interneuron will then basically, so the cell body, the mass of that nerve is within the dorsal horn of the spinal cord or in one of the medullary nuclei, those islands of gray matter in the medulla. And then they will go up to the thalamus or the cerebellum, which is stop. So if they go to the cerebellum, they stop there. So it's just first and second order. But all the other ones, there's a third order neuron. Again, another in between neuron coming from the thalamus, going into wherever the appropriate area of the cortex is. Again, no third order one to the cerebellum. So these are the big pathways that really give us information from our body and our surroundings. They are called, and I touched on it a little bit before, those wide columns of white matter in the back of, or in the posterior aspect, sort of sandwiched between the horns, the gray matter, the dorsal horns, are called the dorsal columns. Again, columns are white. So they call it the dorsal column and medial lemniscus. You have to know that. And then they're the spinal thalamics. And so they really are what they're about. So the dorsal columns are more about proprioceptors, general sensation, where the spinal thalamics, sharp, dull, hot, cold, pain. That's really the best way to describe it. So whether it's subtle positional changes, little bits of vibration, something putting pressure on a particular area, that's more dorsal column, as opposed to spinal thalamics, which is much more, let's say, acute and distinctive sensation that we can identify. And the spinocerebellars are just additional information going to the cerebrum, the part, to the cerebellum. Again, giving you an idea of your body position so that you can move accordingly in that area. Come on in. You're in, yes.
I just have one quick question.
Go ahead.
My internet is tore up in my building.
Okay.
I have a meeting with my success coach about my 504,
right.
501, whatever it is. Do you mind if I join virtually
sure.
while I'm there? And
absolutely.
Come?
No problem.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're
I just
welcome.
wanted to make sure.
No, it's all good.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So once again, pardon me, that's the spinocerebellum. I had a student from another laboratory from not one of our group. So somatic sensory cortex, discriminative touch, vibrate. So that's more non-specific. When say discriminative, am I touching a penny or a quarter? That would be rather than, oh, that hurts, and vibrations. And then there's when it's sufficiently large, you have two groups of white matter, and the fancy name we give them is fasciculi. So they're called the cuneus and the gracilis. And you don't have to know any of those. Okay, those are graduate level. And spinal thalamics, pain, temperature. Yes, I'm touching something. Yes, there's some pressure. Those are, and they're within what are called the lateral spinal thalamic tracts. Spinocerebellar, again, muscle and tendon information, muscle coordination. And so this is could be an example of something that you would see. So a spinocerebellar, let's say the muscle stretch, you stretch your leg out, it would come in to the dorsal area of the spinal cord in the posterior column and into the posterior horn itself. It would synapse there, and it would go all the way up and eventually go right to the cerebellum. That's where one of those inferior cerebellar peduncles would be the passageway that they would come up, this spinocerebellar tract. Now I stepped on something. Sharp, somebody lifts something on the floor in bare feet. Here is the sensory nerve. Here is that dorsal root ganglia. that comes in. Yes, it's going to send a signal there because maybe if it's something sharp, you'll reflexly move your foot. Okay, that's what that little end is. But the bulk of the nerve goes up on the same side. Okay, as you can see it within these particular structures that are there. This is a dorsal column medial meniscus type of pathway. So you stepped on something. It wouldn't necessarily be an ouch. This would be just sort of like there's something like I feel a stone in my shoe. Quote the Godfather. And then it would work its way up through those, again, medial meniscus pathways. And then eventually it would be relayed once it synapses here. So you can see the first level that comes here. And you can see here so this location is medulla. That's where it crosses over, goes to second order, ends here in the thalamus, and then it directs to the spinal centrum. This is the classic pain. So that's why it confused me a little bit. With pain, so let's say you stepped on something that was hot, like you were going out to go to the pool and you stepped on pavement that was hotter than you expected. So that, the first order neuron, the pain sensor, will end within the spinal cord, in where the synapse is, or the peri, where they meet, in the dorsal horn. It will cross over through that gray commissure, work its way all the way up now to the thalamus. Notice it doesn't stop. That's what I meant by lateral spino, because it comes from the spinal column up to the thalamic area. And then eventually directing that signal. So it depends on whether it's sharp or whether it's just sort of non-specific in that regard. Let me give you a summary of this. And then the descending pathways, the direct ones, the ones that are giving the major instruction, those are the corticospinals, particularly the lateral corticospinal. And again, the consisting of upper and lower motor neurons, which we covered before. The upper one is called the pyramidal cell because they form those pyramids at the medullary level. Okay, and it comes from the primary motor cortex, where we say move your arm, to the lower motor, which wherever it ends, let's say that first order nerve, somewhere in the cervical, let's say the lower cervical spine area, then it will you'll move whatever arm muscles it directs you by way of lower motor neurons. So they go in that precentral or primary motor gyrus, lateral. There's some crossover, not crossover, there's some additional fibers that will travel in the ventral cortical spinal tract, but we're going to focus on the lateral. Descend without synapsing until it reaches the rear in the spinal cord, and then it synapses with interneurons there, and basically in the ventral horn, and then it's going to go to where it's going. So take a look. So here we have going through the cerebral peduncles, those big mounds in front that are sort of holding up the cerebral cortex. Notice the thalamus is not reeling, it's not involved with this. Here you can see the pyramidal area that we in the pons. And then when we get to the pyramidal area, notice they decussate in the pyramids. So it crosses over, let's say the signal is going from this side, is crossing over to the other side. It's going down that column. Synapse is here, that's the first order. And the second one goes out to direct the muscle what it's going to do. So the upper, rather, I should say first order. First order, and then, I beg your pardon, upper motor neuron, and then lower motor neuron. So you're going to be very, very long in that regard. And then you can see, and some of these where you can just begin to get an idea of the extent and the length that's there. So they call that particular, where the pyramidal tracts are coming, they call that the internal capsule. So then there's other of these, they're more complex pathways, posture, different kinds of limb movements that aren't very, very specific, head, neck, and eye movements, following things. We're constantly doing that. I heard a knock on my door when this young lady just came in, and I hear it, I turn my head a little bit. That's the kind of thing that goes on. And there's different pathways. So postural muscles going from the vestibular, which means from the balancing area, the reticular area, also associated with balance. Rubrospinal for flexor muscles. You don't have to know these just yet. Tectum, again, is that superior colliculi, head movements, etc. Just gives you an idea what's going on. And I did want to bring those to you. You can see how elaborate these tracks are within the brain and heading out to the brain stem and eventually heading out to the spine. And that was the last bit I didn't want to present. When we come back on Friday, we'll start with the eye anatomy and ear anatomy. That's right. that we're doing. So I know it's a brief presentation, but thank you very much.